Welcome to Leaping Larry's Revolutionary Reading Theatre.
The day we've been waiting for. We're doing Stalin, Foundations of Leninism. You're on chapter 6, the national question. Oh yeah. I was getting a pop, so I forgot to turn the light red. Gotta have the light red for reading. Red is the color of learning. When you're watching the vids on YouTube, then you see a guy getting spladled randomly. Yeah, I think that adds to the reading, honestly. I really think that kind of adds to the reading. It's unique, you know? You can go get a reading anywhere where somebody is there giving you the professional, like, very voiceover sounding reading. Then you can go to Larry's where you get the trailer park boys style reading, you know? We're drinking, we're talking about other shit while we're reading. We're we're ranting about the book and we're spladling. This is where you go to get your reading if you're on that same learning level of self brain expansion that yeah, the good word papers, the brain expanding, the good word papers reading, you know. I can't think good right now, but you know what I mean. The words from other departments, well, not departments, but you know what I mean right now, guy. I can't express myself, but I know I am smart. Okay, and that's why I'm gonna read. Yeah. It's okay. You can smoke and swear here. Good, good, because I won't be able to make my point known unless I can smoke and swear. Especially when we're dealing with this question, the national question. This is one question where I do get a little bit emotional about it, you know? I do, Larry, I know I'm doing a little bit of a performance art. I gotta turn it on sometimes. You all don't know when I'm milking it or when I'm not. That's good. That's the hope. This does get me a little bit emotional sometimes, I'll tell you, okay? And in fact, Stalin also used to get emotional about this very question. There's a funny anti-Stalin narrative that the Trotskyists like to parrot, where they say about how um, they say about how Stalin wrote a rude letter to Lenin's wife, right? And that is somehow proof that Stalin was bad, right? That he wrote this rude letter to Lenin's wife. Therefore, Stalin is bad, and therefore Trotsky should have been the leader, right? And the funny thing, of course, the funny thing about that is Stalin actually responds about this, and he's like, "Yeah, I am rude to people who mistake the national question." Right? He says, "I am rude to people who," and the other reason why he's rude is like Lenin's wife was also kind of like trying to get Lenin to like think about all this political stuff and things when like Lenin was going through like stroke and shit, right? So I just find it funny that like his response to somebody saying he was rude to Lenin's wife was, "Yeah, I am rude. I'm rude when people distort the national question. In other words, when people are chauvinistic about the national question. Just like how if you have a pat sock, if you see someone with a pat sock take, or I see someone with a pat sock take, I tend to get rude about it too." We also know the other reasons why Stalin was rude to her. Yeah, well, that's we just we won't. They hit. Yeah, Stalin was ace. Let's just say the fraternal Soviet kiss between Stalin and Lenin might not have been so fraternal. What I mean. Joined 15 minutes ago, banned from Central Committee and Benny Dog Gay. How do I feel like you gotta be real like slimy to get banned from Central Committee, right? I feel like I've seen some pretty ridiculous chatters, but that's just all right. Let me and with that, let me get reading. Almost did a Daffy Duck kind of thing. Okay, Mama. Good, have a good stream, comrade. So, Chapter 6 The National Question. From this theme, I take two main questions: presentation of the question, A, and B, the liberation movement of the oppressed peoples and the proletarian revolution. It's literally the second thing he says. Actually, you know what? We're done. It's the second thing he says. Proven. Okay. Kidding. But it is literally B. It's literally B. It's right there. Like Pat Socks, all you gotta do is read number B. Letter B. Read this one. Not that hard. Hey, powerful, welcome in. Reading Foundations of Leninism. The presentation of the question. Number one. During the last 2 decades, the national question has undergone a number of very important changes. The national question in the period of the Second International and the national question in the period of Leninism are far from being the same thing. They differ profoundly from each other, not only in their scope, but also in their intrinsic character. I can't stop laughing that I said Leninism. Oh god, I'm sorry. Leninism is killing me. I say it every time. Just slip it in, yeah. Formerly, the national question was usually confined to a narrow circle of questions concerning primarily civilized quote unquote nations. The Irish, the Hungarians, the Poles, the Finns, the Serbs, and several other European nationalities. That was the circle of unequal people in whose destinies the leaders of the Second International were interested. The scores and hundreds of millions of Asiatic and African people were suffering national oppression in its most savage and brutal form usually remained outside of their field of vision. Again, when I tell you that these Patsocks are just like the opportunists in the Second International, you're seeing it, right? Like you're seeing what I'm talking about. Again, like me begging Noah, like, hey, your analysis doesn't even include native people or settler colonialism at all. And his response to that is, he's screeching read settlers. It's like this. They're doing exactly this. That their analysis only includes the civilized nationalities for those which the civilized nationalities at the time are concerned with, right? In the case of Palestine, their support in many respects, while they might not feel like it is, it's very opportunistic, right? And so they're doing the same shit as this. They leave out the national oppressions which are uncomfortable or which are too difficult for them to analyze. Yeah, no need to read Settlers, Noah, but maybe you should have at least read Stalin before pretending to. Exactly. But also, I'm not saying not to read Settlers. Yeah, Noah, a Patsock. One of the leaders of the whole Patsock thing. They hesitated to put white and black, civilized and uncivilized on the same plane. Two or three meaningless, lukewarm resolutions, which carefully evaded the question of liberating the colonies. That was all the leaders of the Second International could boast of. Again, does that sound familiar? Now we can say that the duplicity and half heartedness in dealing with the national question has been brought to an end. Leninism laid bare this crying incongruity, broke down the wall between whites and blacks, between European and Asiatics, between the civilized and uncivilized, quote unquote, slaves of imperialism, and thus linked the national question with the question of the colonies. National question was thereby transformed from a particular and internal state problem into a general and international problem, to a world problem of emancipating the oppressed peoples in the dependent countries and colonies from the yoke of imperialism. That includes settler colonialism and neo-colonialism and old-fashioned colonialism too. Just, just so you know. Yeah, we don't need a pipeline. That's just it. We don't need a pipeline from Patsock to National Socialism because that's what it already is. It's just that in a slightly different form, right? Like think about Hitler, right? Think about Nazis. What did they call themselves? National Socialists, right? And what did they do? Sure, Hitler himself might have said, I'm not a Marxist socialist, I'm a different kind of socialist, a national socialist. Okay, fine. These ones, instead of saying that, say, we're a Marxist, but we're the patriotic Marxists. It's not any different, it's just slightly different wording, you see. Now they're using now they're using Marx instead of discrediting Marx. Because at the time in Germany, there was a certain popularity among libertarian communists and stuff to support the anti-Marxist socialism, right? Yeah, and they did that because socialism in general was very popular. Exactly. Which is and the same reason why why the Pat Sox do it here, because the popularity of socialism is increasing, and that's when they become more prominent in the self-described one. As I say, that's to leave out the fact that Pat Sock as a tendency has been a problem since the earliest days of the left here in the West. And now we have, yeah, sentiment. And that's the thing. Now we have to fight against people who conflate. And it's actually something that we do have to reckon with. We have to reckon with the fact that people now conflate those Pat Socks with Marxists in general, with scientific socialists. And we have to combat that and point out that they're not Marxists. They're not a different variety of Marxists. They're simply not Marxists. They're opportunists, right? Just like how the opportunists in the Second International, they weren't actually Marxists. They pretended to be Marxists, but being opportunists cancels out you being a Marxist, right? The moment you become an the moment you become an opportunist is the moment you renounce Marxism in practice. Formally, the principle of self-determination of nations was usually misinterpreted, and not infrequently it was narrowed down to the idea of the right of nations to autonomy. Certain leaders of the Second International even went so far as to turn the right of self determination the right to cultural autonomy, i.e., the right of oppressed nations to have their own cultural institutions, leaving all political power in the hands of the ruling nation. Sound familiar? I'm going to say that a lot while we're reading. As a consequence, the idea of self determination stood in danger of being transformed from an instrument for combating annexations to an instrument for justifying them. And yeah, the continued occupation of First Nations land here is an occupation, in case you're curious. It's an annexation. Now we can say that this confusion has been cleared up. Leninism broadened the conception of self determinism, interpreting it as the right of oppressed peoples of the dependent countries, colonies, to complete succession. There is no skirting around it here. He makes it very clear. The right of oppressed peoples of the dependent countries and colonies to complete succession. There's no dancing around it there, right? No way to misinterpret what that says. As the right of nations to independent existence as states. Surprise, surprise, that includes First Nations. I know, wild, huh? Wild to imagine. This precluded the possibility of justifying annexations by interpreting the right to self-determinism as the right to autonomy. Thus, the principle of self-determinism itself was transformed from an instrument for deceiving the masses, which it undoubtedly was in the hands of the social chauvinists during the imperialist war, into an instrument for exposing all imperialist aspirations, chauvinist machinations, into an instrument for the political education of the masses, spirit of internationalism. Not sure if he does. Can't remember. I guess we'll find out soon. LHS. It's not very long. It is a very good read though. And he does have a longer work as well, which I do have linked in my um suggested reads, which is like just a longer version of the national question. But it was written a number of years before. Well, not that far before, because this is 1924. Find out soon. Formally, the question of oppressed nations was usually regarded as purely a juridical question. Solemn proclamations about national equality of rights, innumerable declarations about the equality of nations. That was the stock in trade of the parties of the Second International, which glossed over the fact that equality of nations under imperialism, where one group of nations, a minority, lives by exploiting another group of nations, is sheer mockery of the oppressed nations. Now we can say that this bourgeois juridical point of view, the national question has been exposed. Leninism brought the national question down from the lofty heights of high sounding declarations, solid ground, and declared that pronouncements about the equality of nations, not backed by the direct support of the proletarian parties for the liberation struggle of the oppressed nations, are meaningless and false. In this way, the question of the oppressed nations became one of supporting the oppressed nations, of rendering real and continuous assistance to them, their struggle against imperialism for real equality of nations, for their independent existence as states. And I will not trust a single communist party who doesn't do that. That is my minimum criteria for not for not just critiquing the shit out of your party. If that is not part of your party ain't worth a shit. Even if it sends money to Cuba. Isn't worth shit if it doesn't give anything back to the fucking lands that it exists on fucking stolen land of, with a bunch of settlers in the fucking leadership. Sorry, all settlers in the leadership, my bad. Formally, the national question was regarded as a reformist point of view, as an independent question, having no connection with the general question of the power of capital. Again, this is what Midwestern Marx does. Of the overthrow of imperialism, of the proletarian revolution. It was tacitly assumed that the victory of the proletariat in Europe was possible without a direct alliance with the liberation movement of colonies. That the national colonial question could be solved on the quiet of its own accord, off the highway of the proletarian revolution, without a revolutionary struggle against imperialism. Now, we can say that anti-revolutionary point of view has been exposed. Leninism has proved, and the imperialist war and the revolution in Russia has confirmed that the national question solved only in connection with and on the basis of the proletarian revolution, and that the road to victory of the revolution in the West lies through the revolutionary alliance, the liberation movement of the colonies and dependent countries against imperialism. National question is a part of the general question of the proletarian revolution, part of the question of the dictator of the proletariat. The question is as follows. Are the revolutionary potentialities latent? The revolutionary liberation movement of the oppressed country already exhausted or not? And if not, is there any hope, any basis for utilizing these potentialities for the proletarian revolution? For transforming the dependent and colonial countries from a reserve of the imperialist bourgeoisie into a reserve of the revolutionary proletariat, to an ally of the latter? Leninism replies to this question in the affirmative, i.e., it recognizes the existence of revolutionary capacities, the national liberation movement of the oppressed countries, and possibility using these overthrowing the common enemy, for overthrowing imperialism, the mechanics of development of imperialism, the imperialist war, and the revolution in Russia wholly confirm the conclusions of Leninism. Hence, the necessity for the proletariat of the quote unquote dominant nations to support resolutely and actively support the national liberation movement of the oppressed and dependent people. This does not mean, of course, that the proletariat must support every national movement everywhere and always. In every individual concrete case, it means that support must be given to such national movements as tend to weaken, overthrow imperialism, and not to strengthen and preserve it. Such as, a national liberation movement that seeks to preserve settler colonialism. Right? Cases occur when the national movements in certain oppressed countries came into conflict with the interests of the development of the proletarian movement. In such cases, support is, of course, entirely out of the question. The question of the right of nations is not an isolated, self-sufficient question. It is part of the general problem of the proletarian revolution, subordinate to the whole, and must be considered from the point of view of the whole. In the 40s of the last century, Marx supported the national movement of the Poles and Hungarians, and was opposed to the national movement of the Czechs and South Slavs. Why? Because the Czechs and South Slavs were then reactionary peoples, Russian outposts in Europe, outposts of absolutism, where the Poles and Hungarians were revolutionary people, fighting against absolutism. Because support of the national movement of the Czechs and South Slavs was, at that time, equivalent to indirect support for Tsarism, the most dangerous enemy of the revolutionary movement in Europe. Various demands of democracy writes Lenin, including self-determination, are not an absolute, but a small part. General democratic, now general socialist. In individual concrete cases, the part may contradict the whole. If so, it must be rejected. Lenin. This is the position in regard to the question of particular national movements, of the possible reactionary character of these movements. If, of course, they are appraised not from the formal point of view, not from the point of view of abstract rights, but concretely from the point of view of the interests of the revolutionary movement. And now we can think of more modern examples of this as well, right? Like, think about Taiwan. The independent movement in Taiwan, for example, is a example of this, where they will even use natives, the native people in Taiwan, is that right? And I mean, Hong Kong, even, right, was another one with the protests, the attempted color revolution that the US tried to stoke. This absolute, this absolutely very much related to that as well. That in mind when, I mean, and Ukraine, right? The way it's framed is Ukraine versus Russia, but of course the nation with Donsk and Donbass are completely left out of that whole narrative. The unquestionably, has anyone seen that the Prime Minister of Slovakia was shot? Shit, really, Rob? Like assassination? Some people are still trying to make that argument for Crimea. Oh my god. Don't even. They were celebrating. People celebrated. Like, the majority of people celebrated when that decision was made. So, I didn't know. He was wounded. Wow, that is fucked. What's going on there? Come on, Bug is. Say hi. Crying. I'm coming to say hi and play in your room. Same must be said. The ice curtain with Big Dobby, they moved 30 natives to inland Russia. I'm trying to dig. I mean, yeah, Teuton. If you want to get a good context for what you're talking about there, I highly recommend our book right here. Like, not to say that mistakes and things didn't happen there. Like, we're not saying that at all, but just saying that should have proper context for why those things occurred. And this book right here, Stalin History and Critique of a Black Legend, is a great place to get the proper context for those things. And come away from it and still like place these things as on the shoulders of Stalin or something like that, then you're doing your own analogy of the USSR a huge disservice. I definitely think, yeah, check this out. And he contrasts it with what other governments and stuff were doing as well. Yeah, not to excuse it, but to explain it. Yeah, definitely recommend this. And it's a free PDF as well for anybody who's interested in also reading. Same must be said of the revolutionary character of national movements in general. The unquestionably revolutionary character of the vast majority of national movements is as relative and peculiar as is the possible revolutionary character of certain particular national movements. Revolutionary character of a national movement under the conditions of imperialist oppression does not necessarily presuppose the existence of proletarian elements in the movement. The existence of a revolutionary or a republican program of the movement, the existence of a democratic basis of the movement, the struggle that the Emir of Afghanistan is waging for the independence of Afghanistan is objectively a revolutionary struggle, despite the monarchist views of the Emir and his associates. For it weakens, disintegrates, and undermines imperialism, whereas the struggle waged by such desperate Democrats and socialists, revolutionaries, and Republicans as, for example, Krinsky and Cosaratelli and Rinaldi and Scheinman and Chernov and Dan Henderson and Kleins during the imperialist war was a reactionary struggle. For its results was the embellishment, the strengthening, the victory of imperialism. For the same reasons, the struggle that the Egyptian merchants and bourgeois intellectuals are waging for the independence of Egypt is objectively a revolutionary struggle, despite the bourgeois origins and bourgeois title of the leaders of Egyptian national movement, despite the fact that they are opposed to socialism, whereas the struggle that the British Labour government is waging to preserve Egypt's dependent position is, for the same reason, a reactionary struggle, despite the proletarian origin and the proletarian title of the members of the government, despite the fact that they are for socialism. There is no need to mention the national movement in other larger colonial independent countries such as India and China, every step of which, along the road to liberation, even if it runs counter to the demands of formal democracy, is a steam hammer blow at imperialism, i.e., is undoubtedly a revolutionary step. Just as land back here is the same thing. And those who oppose it are just like the British Labour government. Despite them using left sounding language, proletarian sounding language, they are literally doing the opposite. In the Stalin book, LHS? Have to look. It's been a while since we read this. I did read it on style. If I can tell by gonna be probably right here. Yeah. Gonna be right here probably. Number around chapter. I'm gonna say either chapter 3 or chapter 4, lesbian hot sauce. Not sure exactly. Chapter 3 or 4 be my best guess though. Huggy's laying behind me. Lenin was right in saying that the national movement of the oppressed countries should not be appraised not from the point of view of formal democracy, but from the point of view of actual results, as shown by the general balance sheet struggle against imperialism. That is to say, not in isolation, but on a world scale. Lenin. 2. The liberation movement of the oppressed peoples and the proletarian revolution. Solving the national question, Leninism proceeds from the following thesis. A. world is divided into two camps. Camp of the handful of civilized nations which possess finance capital, exploit the vast majority of the population of the globe, the camp of the oppressed and exploited people, the colonies, dependent countries, which constitute the majority. That part's so important, which constitute the majority. Now, one way that Midwestern Marx and other Patsocks try to discredit the Native Liberation Movement is by saying that we are a minority here, saying that we're only such and such a percentage of the population. But what they don't realize is that we have a common interest with the rest of the oppressed peoples in the world. That we, along with them, constitute the vast majority. Understand? We're the vast majority, not the minority. The oppressed people are in the majority. And even here, because again of the solidarity with the global south, still in the vast, our power remains in the vast majority. How can they claim and revise Stalin but not read this? I mean, they pretend to read it. That's the sad part, right? The world is divided into two camps. Sorry, I already said this part. B. The colonies and dependent countries, oppressed and exploited by finance capital, constitute a vast reserve and very important source of strength for imperialism. C. Revolutionary struggle of the oppressed peoples in dependent and colonial countries against imperialism is the only road that leads to their emancipation from oppression and exploitation. D. Most important colonial and dependent countries have already taken the path of national liberation movement, cannot but lead to the crisis of world capitalism. E. The interests of the proletarian movement in the developed countries and of the national liberation movement in the colonies call for the union of two forms of the revolutionary movement, a common front against the common enemy, against imperialism. F. And again, there's that common front. This is why I say even though First Nations might constitute a minority in their own country, in the movement, in the proletarian revolution, it's part of the majority and enjoys solidarity and support of the rest of the majority. Which is why we constantly say that black people and native people don't need white allies in order to win revolution, that it can be done without them. Not just like a revolutionary optimism, that's simply the truth. F. The victory of the working class in the developed countries and the liberation of the oppressed peoples from the yoke of imperialism are impossible without the formation of the consolidation of a common revolutionary front. D. The formation of a common revolutionary front is possible unless the proletariat of the oppressor nation render direct and determined support to the liberation movement of the oppressed peoples against imperialism of its own country, for no nation can be free if it oppresses other nations. Ingalls. H. This support implies the upholding, defense, and implementation of the slogan of the right of nations to secession, to independent existence in states. I love that quote too, Ton. If you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you come here because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. Fuck yes. I. Unless this slogan is implemented, the union and collaboration of nations within a single world economic system, the real basis for the victory of world socialism, cannot be brought about. Very important. J. This union can only be voluntary, arising on the basis of mutual confidence and fraternal relations among people. Hence, the two sides, two tendencies of the national question: the tendency towards political emancipation from the shackles of imperialism, and towards the formation of an independent national state, a tendency which arose as a consequence of imperialist oppression and colonial exploitation. This is why this right here statement, right, very simple, easy to understand statement right here, is why I get so upset and why I have no tolerance for anarchists who parrot bourgeois lies about socialist countries and feel the need to critique them in a world where their imperialist countries, their NATO countries that they often live in, are busy fomenting hatred in order to justify casus belli and war and aggression against all these countries. If you spend your time doing that instead of fighting against that fomenting of that hatred, then that's suspect as shit to me. You know? So anyone who doesn't recognize that these states that are fighting against colonialism and imperialism, they fight the way they do because it is necessitated that they fight that way because of imperialist oppression and colonial exploitation. For example, when you poo-poo DPRK's nuclear deterrence or whatever, like, the reason they have nuclear deterrence is because they're forced to have nuclear deterrence. Let's quote Lenin now. Quote, developing capitalism, says Lenin, knows two historical tendencies in the national question. First, the awakening of national life and national movements, struggle against all national oppression, creation of national states. Second, development and acceleration of all kinds of intercourse between nations, breakdown of national barriers, creation of international unity of capital, economic life in general, of politics, science, etc. Both tendencies are a worldwide law of capitalism. First predominates at the beginning of its development, second characterizes mature capitalism, that is, moving towards its transformation in socialist society. Quote, for imperialism, these two tendencies represent irreconcilable contradictions. Because imperialism cannot exist without exploiting colonies and forcibly retaining them within the framework of the integral whole. Because imperialism can bring nations together only by means of annexations and colonial conquest, without which imperialism is, generally speaking, inconceivable. Communism, on the contrary, these tendencies are but two sides of a single cause of the emancipation of the oppressed peoples from the yoke of imperialism. Because communism knows that the union of people in a single world economic system is possible only on the basis of mutual confidence and voluntary agreement. That the road to the formation of a voluntary union of people lies through the separation of the colonies, the integral, imperialist whole, through the transformation of the colonies independent states. Hence the necessity for a stubborn, continuous, and determined struggle against the dominant nation chauvinism of the socialist of the ruling nations, Britain, France, America, Italy, Japan, etc., who do not want to fight against their imperialist government, who do not want to struggle, who do not want to support the struggle of the oppressed peoples in their colonies for emancipation, oppression, succession, hat socks, in other words. Without such a struggle, the education of the working class of the ruling nations, the spirit of true internationalism, the spirit of closer relations with the toiling masses of the dependent countries and colonies, the spirit of real preparation for the proletarian revolution is inconceivable. The revolution would not have been victorious in Russia. Kolchak and Denikin would not have been crushed had not the Russian proletariat enjoyed the sympathy, support of the oppressed peoples, the former Russian Empire. But how did it get that support and sympathy, you might ask? But first, to win the sympathy and support of these people, it had to, first of all, break the fetters, Russian imperialism, and free these people from the yoke of national oppression. Note, first, right? It only makes sense. In order to get the support of the native people, you first have to support their struggle for national liberation. Why is that so hard for these motherfucking Patstock supporters to understand here? I'm not talking about the grifters. I'm not talking about the grifters that know better. I'm talking about the ones who are fooled by the grift, right? Why is it so hard for them to understand that? All they have to do is read this work, and it's very, very clear, right? That in order for you to have support of First Nations, Black people here in the West, the struggle for socialism, you first have to support their struggle for national liberation. And then we can struggle onwards towards socialism. It's a very simple, that is stage, is that it can go no other way, because you can't build socialism while you have sections, huge sections, the most revolutionary sections opposing you. Without this, it would have been impossible to consolidate Soviet power, to implant real internationalism, and to create that remarkable organization, the collaboration of people, which is called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and which is the living prototype of the future union of people in a single world economic system. Hence the necessity of fighting against the national isolationism, narrowness, and aloofness of the socialist in the oppressed countries, who do not want to rise above their national precarialism, who do not want to understand the connection between the liberation movements of their own countries and the liberation movement and the proletarian movement in the ruling countries. Without such a struggle, it is inconceivable that the proletariat of the oppressed nation can maintain an independent policy, and its class solidarity, the proletariat of the ruling countries, the fight for the overthrow of the common enemy, the fight for the overthrow of imperialism. Without such a struggle, internationalism would be impossible. Such is the way in which the toiling masses of the dominant and oppressed nations must be educated in the spirit of revolutionary internationalism. Here is what Lenin says about the twofold task of communism educating the workers in the spirit of internationalism. Such education be concretely identical in great oppressing nations and in small oppressed nations, in annexing nations and in annexed nations? Obviously not. The way to the one goal, to complete equality, the closest relations and the subsequent amalgamation of all nations, obviously here by different routes. Concrete case. Same way, let us say, as the route to the point in the middle of the given page lies towards the left from one edge and towards the right from the opposite edge. If a social democrat belonging to a great oppressing annexing nation, while advocating the amalgamation of nations in general, forget even for one moment that his Nicholas and his William, George, John Kerr, etc., also stands for the amalgamation of small nations by means of annexations, Nicholas II being for amalgamation with Glacia, Wilhelm II for amalgamation with Belgium, etc. Such a social democrat would be a ridiculous doctrinaire in theory and an arbiter of imperial practice. This is what they do. The weight of emphasis, the internationalist education of the workers in the oppressing countries must necessarily consist in their advocating and upholding freedom of succession for oppressed countries. Without this, there can be no internationalism. It is our right and duty to treat every social democrat of an oppressing nation who fails to conduct such propaganda as an imperialist and a scoundrel. And that is why I treat Noah and Midwestern Marx the way I do. And anybody else who parrots bullshit lies about socialist countries. That's why I call them out. That's why I just simply deal with Midwestern Marx the way I do. Because they are imperialist and scoundrels. This is an absolute demand. Even if the chance of succession being possible and feasible for the introduction of socialism be 1 in 1,000. On the other hand, a social democrat belonging to a small nation must emphasize in his agitation the second word of our general formula, voluntary union of nations. He may, without violating his duties as an internationalist, favor of either political independence of his nation or its inclusion in a neighboring state XYZ, etc. But in all cases, must fight against small nation narrow-mindedness, isolationism, and aloofness. Must fight for the recognition of the whole, general, the subordination of the interests of the particular to the interests of the general. Which, by the way, and this is what Noah, with to be fair, with Noah's big, barely coherent paragraph that he wrote for me that time when I just made fun of him. Remember that? I just mocked his giant paragraph and was like, this just makes me want to shove you in a locker. This just makes no sense. Like, it just sounds like gobbledygook, remember? He was basically getting to this. He was trying to say something along the lines of this. But of course, because he's not being truthful and because he's being like a dishonest scoundrel, it makes no sense because it's trying to justify incorrect reactionary opinion, right? Whereas, as you know, First Nations revolutionaries like myself, we are not fighting for the particular. We're not fighting for just the liberation of the Mi'kmaq Nation against the interests of the general. Which is why I constantly remind you, comrades, that land back and liberation of First Nations is in the interest of the general, is in the general interest of everybody, right? Because of what we are fighting for, which champions the interests of everybody, including settlers, right? Actually champions their interests far better than anything Noah is pushing, or of course, to say nothing of the current ideologies that we have are forced to live, right? So the reason why I just joked about his argument is because it was a non-starter of an argument. You all know very well that First Nations are for unity, not for balkanization, and we're for the interests of everybody. That's the point of liberation. I just wanted to address that real quick. And people who have not gone thoroughly into the question think there is a contradiction in social democrats of oppressing nations insisting on freedom of succession, while social democrats of oppressed nations insist on freedom of union. However, little reflection will show that there is not and cannot be any other road leading from the given situation to internationalism, the amalgamation of nations, any other road to this goal. Lenin. And there you go. That's the national question, everybody. What do you think? Questions, comments, concerns?